Okay, well, thanks everyone for joining us today. As I said, my name is Stephan Haggard. I direct the Korea Pacific program here at the School of Global Policy and Strategy at the University of California, San Diego. We took a small hiatus in the winter quarter with respect to our webinar series, but this spring we're doing several events. And for those of you who follow economics on the Korean Peninsula, I want to just provide a brief preview of a webinar we have coming up in a couple of weeks in May 10th, Pacific Daylight Time, May 11th in Seoul. And it's on sectoral shifts, technological change, and old labor. And it's looking at some of the issues surrounding the technological transformations which are taking place in the United States and Korea, and how those affect labor and labor movement. So if you're interested, please feel free to register for that event. And then turning to today, I'm really pleased to have this conversation with Heino Klinck. I'll give you a little bit more detail on him, but he was introduced by one of our members of our International Advisory Board, and we've already had fun having a number of conversations about some of his time at the Pentagon. One of the things that attracted me to getting Heino on was that he was an Army Foreign Affairs officer. And we have a number of you, I think possibly even on this call, who are also FAOs in our MAS program. And he had extensive Asia-focused assignments in that capacity. He had military attaché duty in Beijing and Hong Kong, as well as positions in the Army staff, the Joint Staff, the Defense Intelligence Agency, and headquarters of the U.S. Army Pacific. He also has experience in the private sector, which is interesting to us. I'm going to ask Heino to say a few things about his career, but we're talking to him today in part because he served about for the last 18 months of the Trump administration as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for East Asia. And Heino, you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but looking at that job description, it looks more like the Assistant Secretary of State position in that regard, because basically Heino had responsibility for most of the region and had responsibility for defense strategy development, for security cooperation, contingency planning, and program oversight. But there's also an interagency component to this job, as he'll say. And so he was working with people in the intelligence community, at the National Security Council, and at state with respect to US diplomacy toward the region. So Heino, thanks very much for joining us. I really appreciate you coming on board.
Well, thank you, Stephan, for having me and for this opportunity to talk so broadly with the community in San Diego and in Korea and here in DC and everywhere in between. It's really my pleasure to be with you all today.
Thanks. Well, listen, I'm going to start, before we get to the substance, I'm going to start with a somewhat strange question, which has to do with your career. A number of our students are active military officers, they're FAOs, or they're themselves in transition between military careers and the private sector. Can you just tell us a little bit about how you got to where you got, which was Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense from a career, much of which was spent in the military?
Sure, I'd be happy to. I wish I could tell you it was all part of my master plan, but it didn't quite play out that way. To start at the beginning, I emigrated to the United States as a child, and fast forward to my high school years, knew that the only way I'd be able to afford college is through the military. And I applied for an ROTC scholarship. I got it. And on the condition I become an American, because I wasn't even an American at the time. And so I became an American, joined the Army, went to college, and I thought, I'd do my time that I owed the Army. But I fell in love with the institution and the mission. And I ended up making a career of it and ended up retiring 27 years later. I started off doing, stereotypical Army things, jumping out of airplanes, driving tanks, blowing things up. And I was introduced early in my career to this career field called the Foreign Area Officer Program. And what appealed to me about this program was, frankly, I knew that I'd go back to school. The Army teach me a language, send me back to graduate school. And I thought the training education would be phenomenal. And then followed by a career of being a political military specialist. So I asked to be a China Foreign Area Officer. Fortunately, the Army didn't look that closely at my record since I had a very deep background in Europe already. And the Army did make me a China FAO, sent me off to my training for a total of about 4 years. And then I spent, so about the last 20 years of my military career focused on the U.S. military relationship with China. As you mentioned, I was an attaché in Beijing for 4 years. I was an attaché in Hong Kong for 2 years. I had assignments in Hawaii, multiple assignments in Washington. And my career culminated as being the Director of International Affairs on the Army staff, which is, I likened it to being the Army's foreign minister. So you've got an institution of several million soldiers, right, if you consider Reserve and National Guard, and I was responsible for all of our interaction with foreign militaries, both friendly and not so friendly. It was a great job, loved it, but at a certain point I decided that I couldn't be as flexible anymore as the Army needed me to be, so I decided to retire. Went into the private sector, again, as you mentioned, worked for a big aerospace and defense company doing international business development. And then one day I got a call asking me if I would consider serving in the administration, the previous administration, President Trump's administration. And as someone who is, very much, frankly, a patriot and who grew up spending most of his life serving his adopted homeland in uniform, when I was asked to serve, there was only one answer that I contemplated. That answer was yes. Right. And so I very proudly served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense responsible for East Asia for the last 18, 19 months of the Trump administration. And my portfolio included all the allies, partners that we have in East Asia, most notably, obviously, the Republic of Korea, Japan, Australia, a lot of partners such as Mongolia, New Zealand, Taiwan as well, Pacific Island countries, and of course, just to keep things interesting, also the DPRK. Right, so it was a great experience, and I was, I still feel privileged to have been able to serve my country as a civilian.
Yeah. Let me just ask one more question on this, because again, I think at some point, maybe we can get you together with some of our FAOs who'll be interested in exactly tracing in more detail your career. But I just want to touch briefly on this position, which I think you said you had on the Army staff, being responsible for Mill. So was that also Mill fell under the auspices of that job?
Yes, absolutely. So, so some of the programs that I was responsible for, the Army to Army Staff Talks program, at the time we had staff talks with, I want to say 15, 16, 17 countries worldwide. I actually inaugurated the pseudo staff talks program with the PLA. I also was responsible for the exchange officer program, whereby we send officers and NCOs also to serve in foreign countries, foreign armies, formations, and they reciprocate. And those officers and NCOs are actually treated like Americans, if you will. They're meant to fill those positions that an American would fill otherwise. And again, some of the things, just to kind of give you some real world examples, after the Russian takeover of Crimea, I was charged with invigorating our relationships with the Baltic countries to ensure that they were resilient enough in case the Russians were to try something in the Baltic states like they did in Crimea. In the Middle East, I've had a role in the deployment of air defense assets during various crises. In Africa, I was involved with capacity building efforts. So I literally traveled every continent, but
it was global, yeah. Well, look, Heino, I've talked to you about how we might proceed. As you know, this is a Korea Pacific webinar, but I thought we would start with the larger strategic picture. There's a lot of criticism of the Trump administration among some quarters and defense of it in others, but I think one concept which is clearly here to stay, is this concept of the Indo-Pacific. I don't see any interest or reason, frankly, for Biden to walk away from that term. And I personally think it captures quite well what U.S. strategic objectives in the region entail. But can you perhaps say something about how you saw the Indo-Pacific concept and why you felt the introduction of this was a good move for the United States at this juncture?
Certainly. Well, the phrase and the concept was actually was born in Tokyo. It was Prime Minister Abe's phraseology, if you will. And I would offer that if there's one legacy of the Trump administration in terms of foreign and defense affairs, it's the very transparent appraisal that China is a competitor and in some respects, frankly, an adversary. And that first, was made public in the National Security Strategy of 2017. And if you recall, again, it was, that document very clearly stated that we are now in a near peer competition, or a great power competition, again, specifically with China and to a lesser degree with Russia. And that was really a turning point, I believe. And I think history will view it as a turning point, because previous administrations were unwilling to make that statement. And I will tell you that it's not like overnight, all of a sudden from 2016 to 2017, Chinese activities, Chinese behaviors, Chinese intent had changed. I was in Beijing the last time from 2004 to 2008, and we saw it back then already that China was in essence reorienting itself to become the regional hegemon. The big difference was that under Xi Jinping, Deng Xiaoping's 24 character maxim of, in essence, keep a low profile, bide your time, hide your capabilities, Xi has jettisoned that.
Right.
And again, all these types of activities and the increased capability and the increased intent, stated intent, demonstrable intent, led to the seminal document of 2017 calling out the Chinese. And then in 2018, of course, we had the National Defense Strategy that built upon the 2017 document and called on the U.S. military also to kind of reorient, if you will. And when there were, a couple lines of efforts in that document, the line of effort 2 was strengthen alliances and build new partnerships. And this is something that I really, frankly, aligned myself with, and I saw as my primary raison d'etre in this particular position. And then the other thing that I would say is, if you look at the U.S. strategic framework for the Indo-Pacific that was declassified in January, and I would say, especially to those of you that are students of strategy, look at the National Security Strategy of 2017, the National Defense Strategy of 2018, and the strategic framework that was declassified in January of this year. Look at all those 3 documents in tandem, and you will see that there was, in fact, a plan, there was, in fact, a strategy, and that, we did a pretty good job, frankly, implementing it. And I think the real proof, if you will, is that now with President Biden having been in office just under 100 days, there's very, very little divergence. As a matter of fact, I see mostly continuity and consistency in Trump era policies towards China and East Asia, the part of the world that I was responsible for, in the activities of the Biden administration in the last 100 days.
Yeah, well, I basically agree with that in important respects. I mean, I think there are some issues in the alliances, which we'll get to, that were clearly very different. But I think that this overarching concept widens what the United States had been doing in the region, actually in the entire post-war period, you could argue. And I think it's interesting that you've identified the identification of China as an adversary as sort of core to that. But on the US policy side, and with respect to military strategy, What, in your view, did this require the United States to do differently? We're acknowledging that the Chinese pose a new challenge, and I've seen that, by the way, in the China Watchers community, including here with our own Susan Shirk and others.
That's right.
Who, have kind of shifted their positions. But on the military front, what did this entail? Did this really involve moving military assets in a different way, putting more assets in the region? What was happening at the operational level to implement this approach?
Well, I think most importantly is the change in approach at the strategic level, that we were now very publicly messaging that the United States, in concert with its friends, allies, and like-minded countries, was going to ensure that there's a free and open Indo-Pacific, and we would ensure that the commons, regional commons, would be protected, and that we would not allow the Chinese to further, frankly, turn, for instance, the South China Sea into a Chinese lake. Because, quite frankly, we're not going to be able to turn back what the Chinese have already built, these man-made features in the South China Sea that they've heavily militarized, even though President Xi told President Obama that he wouldn't do that, and that we would sail and fly anywhere that international law would allow us. So to your operational question, we have increased significantly our presence operations in the South China Sea. We routinely sail through the Taiwan Strait. And I think we're demonstrating leadership by doing that. And that has also, I think, advanced the willingness of other countries to do the same. And we've had allies and partners do that. And to fast forward now, if you look just later this year, you have a German frigate that is going to be deploying to the Indo-Pacific. You've got the British QE2 strike group that is going to be deploying in the Indo-Pacific, and the French as well. So I think, operationally, we've demonstrated that we're going to do what we say we're going to do, regardless of what the Chinese posture is. And then, of course, there are other aspects as well, operationally, with respect to movements of forces into the region, greater and more realistic training exercise regimen, again, in tandem with the Japanese and the Australians in particular. Much less so, I would say, with South Korea, to be perfectly frank.
Yeah, that's an issue we'll want to drill down on.
But again, I think the important piece is that it's at the strategic level. Again, we said very publicly what our intent is, and then we carried through with operations that are meant to undergird that strategy.
Yeah, so it's a complicated security architecture, obviously, in Asia that involves both the traditional alliance partners and new institutions like the Quad. Before we go into the Japan-Korea relationship in Korea, can you just say a word about the Quad? Because that's something which obviously also has Japanese origins. The United States picked it up. And this is a relationship, a quadrilateral relationship, though a loose one, between India, Australia, Japan, and the United States. I think it's something else which is obviously going to survive the Trump administration, our interest in that. We've already had a meeting, this year. Can you say just a few words about the Quad? Do you see this as something which could grow, or do you think it's likely to stay the four main parties?
So first, what I would say is that I don't think 2-3 years ago anyone would have imagined that India would be so vocal and so overt about engaging in this Quad format. We have to remember, of course, that India has historically been the leader of the non-aligned movement. So the fact that they were willing to engage at multiple levels, most recently at the head of head of government level with, as you stated, President Biden and the three prime ministers meeting virtually. That is a testament to, frankly, how far the Chinese have pushed them. I view this as an Indian response to Chinese assertiveness and, in some respects, outright aggression on the line of actual control. So although for years the Japanese, the Australians, and the United States had been advocating for closer quadrilateral ties with India and activities as well, including in the military domain, the Indians were not ready to do that until, frankly, the Chinese pushed them very hard. And then also, to be perfectly frank, the United States stood by India and supported them in a variety of ways in response to the Chinese posturing, again, the line of actual control. So I think it was a response to Chinese aggression. I think that whereas nobody's going to describe, and rightfully so, nobody's going to describe the Quad as a military alliance at all, it is certainly a grouping of like-minded countries facing a common threat, and that is the Chinese.
Right. Yeah, no, I mean, you've probably heard this talk, Heino, that, Asian NATO, and is this something that, would expand, would, for example, a Korea be invited, or would there be, setting aside the question of whether they're interested in joining, which I think is an extremely delicate issue. But when you thought about this issue when in office, was there an idea that the Quad would be a vehicle that might potentially expand in membership? I mean, this discussion, for example, of Quad Plus.
So there has been discussion about Quad Plus activities where other countries could self-select if they wanted to participate in certain activities, understanding again that the Quad is not intended to be viewed as any kind of military alliance, even ad hoc. So there are other things that the Quad, for instance, if you think about COVID response, and which was the focus of President Biden's summit with his three counterparts, and other economic types of activities. I think that, so I can tell you, yes, there was conversations involving Quad Plus, and I'm confident that the Biden administration and the other, and the Quad members themselves would be open to that.
Let me just interrupt for a second, Heino, to just remind our listeners, if you do have a question, there are a couple, you see me typing, Heino, I'm not handling my email. I'm dealing with some questions that have come in asking about the Indo-China conflict and what mil-mil means and things like that. But if you do have other questions, feel free to ask us. But let's turn to the Korean Peninsula. We are a Korea webinar, time flies. So can you say anything from your time in office about how the Trump administration tried to deal with the downward spiral in Japan-Korea relations? I mean, this is obviously, it's difficult for the United States to get into the middle of this, but it's really become a kind of, I think, a major challenge for US foreign policy in Northeast Asia is how to deal with that relationship.
No, you're absolutely right. And I would say, I was sworn in just before the Jasomia debacle. And let's see, Jasomia, I'm trying to remember what it stands for, but I would say Google it, GSOMIA. but
I can never remember.
It's a agreement between the government of Japan, the government of Republic of South Korea for information and intelligence sharing.
General Security of Military Information Agreement.
There you go.
That was it. Yeah.
There you go. Thank you for that. And the Moon administration announced its intent in, I want to say, late summer of 2019, not to renew this agreement. And they announced their intent not to renew this agreement on the heels of Secretary Espers, Secretary Esper was the Secretary of Defense at the time, on the heels of his inaugural trip into the region, including to Seoul. And, the South Koreans did not inform their American ally of their intent not to renew this agreement. So when this came out and we read about it in the newspaper, as opposed to having our mutual defense treaty partner inform us in advance, you can imagine we were a bit disappointed. And of course, I don't want to rehash all the history, behind what led to this. As a matter of fact, I think you probably all know it better than I, but, most recently, leading up to this, there was deep consternation and strife between the two countries, having to do, again, based post-war history and reparations, and basically the Japanese then putting sanctions or tariffs against certain commodities and vice versa. So in essence, and again, I'm obviously giving you the Reader's Digest version here, what the U.S. concern was number one, we should have gotten a heads up. Number two, we did not want to see political or economic issues bleed over into military and defense issues, because our position is, and has always been and continues to be, the only parties that benefit when there is strife in the security arena between Tokyo and Seoul reside in Pyongyang, in Beijing, and in Moscow. And that's why we wanted the Japanese and the South Koreans to work it out. Obviously, easier said than done. Although if we, again, review the history back to 2019 and 2020, the South Koreans did not extend the GSOMIA. So we were able to kind of avert that, what would have been a potentially big problem. Now, there were a lot of voices then that said, hey, America, why don't you act as an intermediary between the Japanese and the South Koreans?
That's the question I wanted to ask.
Yeah.
Is whether we have that role or whether it's appropriate. Or...
So it's one of these cases where, again, you're damned if you do, damned if you don't. I can assure you that we tried to, not publicly, but privately, convince both parties to dial things back, in particular, to not have this particular issue bleed into the security and defense arena, because we were adamant that this served no purpose for any of us, and to try to work out the issue at hand through diplomatic means. And if there was going to be tension, keep it in the political and economic arenas. Don't let it go into the security and defense arena. And so on the one hand, I think we were successful because the South Koreans did not pull out of GSOMIA. On the other hand, the underlying issues remain, quite frankly. And I have not seen either Japan or South Korea, try to, finally come to grips with some of these issues. And I don't know if that's even realistic, but I think the underlying historical issues, it's not, I don't think it's reasonable or realistic for America to try to solve that between those two.
Yeah, that's the challenge, of course, right? Yeah.
But I think where it becomes, important is, again, in the defense and the security arena, because although, the South Koreans, may not want to admit it, the Moon administration certainly wouldn't admit it. Any scenario that involves a DPRK, for instance, there's going to be a role that Japan plays. And that's why it is important for there to be good lines of communication between those two countries, sharing of information and intelligence. And I would also say, again, very clearly, the issue is not a military to military or a mill to mill issue between the ROK Armed Forces and the Japanese Self-Defense Forces. The military professionals know that it's in their best interest to cooperate and collaborate. So this was a political issue that was hoisted upon the military.
Yeah, now that's a very important point that I think is often lost, the way that underneath these relationships at the diplomatic level, you actually often have surprising continuity. Right. I mean, I think of the U.S.-Philippines relationship as another example of that.
And if I just make one more editorial comment on this, ironically, at the time, the South Korean Minister of Defense, Minister Jong, who was a retired Air Force 4-star general. He did all of his professional military education in Japan. I think he went to both staff college and war college in Japan. Spoke Japanese, had an affinity for the culture.
I didn't know that.
You know, and I could, you know, I certainly wasn't privy to any of his internal deliberations or thoughts, but I could just imagine, you know, he being, you know, the leader in charge of, you know, in essence conveying, we're not going to extend Jasomia. That had to have been hard for him as well.
Caught in the middle, caught in the middle. Well, look, I have to ask you the unpleasant question of the day, which is you were there while the whole special measures agreement negotiations were going on. And for those of you who don't follow this on a regular basis, this is essentially the decision on the part of the Trump administration to renegotiate the burden sharing arrangements. And in my humble opinion, do one thing which was quite consequential, which is move away from a 5-year timetable on those negotiations to an annual timetable, which means that you're kind of continually negotiating. Can you give us any of your your views of the SMA? I mean, thankfully, this has come to a reasonably good conclusion now, but this must have been a big headache.
It was. So, you know, I mean, again, I'll be perfectly candid with you. I think we could have done a better job. I think part of it was, you know, in my opinion, frankly, we did not ask a reasonable nor a realistic increase in the SMA. You know, the Koreans, frankly, invest, you know, relatively speaking, invest a lot in their defense. I think that, you know, the best percentage of GDP, they invest more in defense than any of our NATO partners do, for instance. And even though I do believe, and I fervently believe, that South Korea should pay more to support the presence of U.S. forces on the peninsula, I think the initial amount that was conveyed early in the Trump administration and then, you know, was made public was an amount that was not realistic, quite frankly, and the Moon administration was never going to be able to accept that. And you know, and so we were basically, both parties painted themselves into a corner, neither of which could appear to compromise. And I think that ended up overshadowing many of the other issues that we try to contend with. But I think that specific dispute was just frankly symptomatic of a, you know, growing misalignment in strategic goals and strategic objectives between the Moon administration and the Trump administration. And frankly, I think some of that misalignment continues today with the Biden administration as well. So I think SMA could have been a pretty easy issue to solve if both sides were willing to compromise. We were not. We had a specific figure in mind, and we were not going to compromise on that. I will tell you that when I left office, I was very confident that SMA, both with South Korea as well as with Japan, because we were also negotiating an SMA renewal with the Japanese, that these issues would be resolved in short order. And I was right. Both were done within the first, less than 60 days of the administration.
No, I think a sigh of relief all the way around, and there's no reason to to beat that issue. I just want to remind people that this was part of Heino's beat, and you know, dealing with that was difficult. Heino, let me ask a question that may seem strange to some observers, which is, you know, you have a left of center government in Seoul, obviously, and has somewhat different perception of threat. But it seems to me that the Moon administration has invested fairly heavily in upgrading its capabilities. I don't know if you think those investments are adequate, but you know, you have this very complex combination of, you know, the kill chain investments, the massive punishment retaliation investments, the missile defense investments. can you speak to this? I
Sure.
mean, it's kind of interesting, and it ties up with operation, OPCON transfer, the transfer of operational control, which is something that might be of interest
Sure.
to listeners as well.
So my understanding is that historically, when there's a left of center government, defense spending actually goes up in South Korea. And Korea hands have told me that that's for a number of reasons. One is to be able to demonstrate greater autonomy in defense matters. Another reason is to be able to deflect conservative critiques, perhaps on political strategies emanating from the Blue House towards the DPRK. So if politically you're being, for instance, criticized for being soft on Pyongyang, your counterweight is, but we're investing in defense, what have you. And another factor could be the nationalist flavor, if you will, of the progressive government. So obviously within the United States and within the Pentagon, we welcome. I think the South Koreans will spend 2.8, 2.9% of GDP on defense. We welcome that. With respect to OPCON transition, which again was mutually agreed upon as a conditions-based approach to transitioning from a 4-star U.S. commander to a 4-star Korean commander, there have been reams of papers written on exactly what needs to happen, again, conditions-based. And part of that is acquiring certain capabilities. And I think there are 20 some odd capabilities, 26 critical military capabilities that the South Korean military would have to obtain before OPCON transition could occur. I will tell you, without getting into the nitty-gritty details, despite these investments in defense capabilities and this increase in defense budget that we've seen in the new administration, and despite the fact that progress has been made, the ROK Armed Forces are nowhere close to getting all 26 of those capabilities. And again, I'll refrain from going into the nitty-gritty detail. But, and one of the big issues we had, and I would say probably from my perspective, one of the biggest challenges we had was, President Moon during his presidential campaign, and I think it was 2017, stated that he wanted to expedite the process of OPCON transition. And he basically wanted it to happen on his watch. So, before 2022. And, it was always agreed upon that it would be conditions-based. You would have to meet the conditions. The alliance would have to meet the conditions.
And that was agreed to by the conditions-based approach was something which was not imposed by the United States. I mean, this was agreed to between the parties.
Absolutely. But again, what was agreed to in finite detail were the conditions that had to be met first. So what President Moon did was, instead of making it a conditions-based approach, he wanted it to be a time-based approach. And for us, that's a red line. Or at least that was a red line for the Trump administration. And I spent a lot of time in conveying that to my Korean counterparts.
Well, I know, our audience is diverse. Many of them know exactly what you and I are talking about. Others maybe we made a little bit of primer. Can we just step back for a second and talk about OPCON transfer a little bit more generally? And maybe you could say something about the Combined Forces command structure and what this would do, and how much of a risk you think moving towards OPCON transfer poses to interoperability, to maintaining a single chain of command. I mean, are these problems in your view that can be easily solved, or do you think this is really a dangerous route to go down?
No, I'm an advocate of OPCON transition. It makes absolute sense. It makes sense for the alliance as a whole, frankly. and it makes sense for the Korean military to have operational control of the forces there. So by that, I mean both the Korean and the U.S. forces there in case of a contingency. Where the risk is not following the agreed to plan and meeting the various conditions. And again, those conditions include the ROC military acquiring certain capabilities. Mind you, the United States will offer certain bridging capabilities until the Koreans can acquire all these on their own. I mean, that's one condition. Another condition is being able to, frankly, contend with the DPRK nuclear and missile threat. And there's, as you know, as I'm sure everybody can agree to, there's still a lot that has to be done in that regard. And then the other issue is just overall, there has to be a conducive security environment on the peninsula. So those are, broadly speaking, the three conditions that are to lead to a transition of a U.S. four-star commander to a Korean four-star commander. Right now, there are three commands on the peninsula that basically a U.S. general, one general wearing three hats: the United Nations Command, the Combined Forces Command, and now I'm having a senior moment.
U.S. Forces Korea, right?
U.S. Forces Korea, excuse me. Yeah, absolutely. So when OPCON transition occurs, the U.S. four-star will, of course, maintain the command of U.S. Forces Korea and the United Nations Command, but the Combined Forces Command, and mind you, this is the only command in the world like this, will move from that American four-stars being the commander to a Korean four-star being the commander.
Yeah, I see. So that's interesting the way you characterize that. So you see that in a way, the Combined Forces Command structure remains intact, but we're sort of shifting around who's at the top. I mean, there must be other components of it. It's more complicated than that.
There are, but in a nutshell, that is the most salient point.
Yeah.
And again, we, the United States, and we've been criticized about potentially slow rolling this, or we've changed our mind, we're not going to do this for whatever reason. That's not the truth, to be perfectly frank. We're all in. We want this to occur. The problem, though, it becomes if we are not going to adhere to the conditions that we agreed to with our ROC counterparts.
Right.
And because that's where the risk is. If the ROCs are not able to, in essence, bring their own indigenous capabilities into play, as the commander, then we are inviting risk. And when you take that in conjunction with the DPRK that has only increased its nuclear stockpile, has only modernized its missile inventory, again, the part about condition 3, conducive security environment, I think we'd be hard pressed to make that argument as well. So once the conditions are met, the United States wants to be able to, as we say, pass the guide on to the ROCs. We're just not there yet.
No, that's interesting. I've certainly talked to other people in the military who have a much more skeptical view of the whole OPCON transfer process than what you've just expressed. So I think that's in some ways reassuring that there's more buy-in to this than is often thought. I think sometimes Koreans believe that the U.S. really doesn't want to do this. That's really the game.
I am confident that there are probably some uniformed American leaders that are not in favor of ever serving under the command of a foreign officer. I mean, I think that there is some of that, frankly, in our institutions. But politically, the United States has signed up for this. We've signed up to do this, and we're committed to doing this as long as the conditions are met.
Great. Well, listen, that we're starting to accumulate a couple of questions, which I want to circle back to. But before we do that, Jade and Christopher and Gonzalo, they're very good questions here. I want to just get briefly to the North Korean piece of the picture, obviously, because that's the whole of the donut we haven't discussed so far. So obviously, after Hanoi, that was a diplomatic disappointment. I'm not sure. I think the president should have gone, but certainly if he went, it was the right thing to walk away. I don't think that what was on offer was adequate. But where did North Korea go after Hanoi from your perspective, Heino? I mean, what was it? How were you thinking about North Korea after Hanoi? Was there hope that things could get back on track after the Hanoi summit, or was it basically, was that door closed?
There was hope, and beyond hope, there was a lot of behind the scenes work that was going on by my State Department counterparts in trying to get the North Koreans back to the table, presuming they would bring something to the table. Our position was that we were not going to offer inducements for negotiations. We would offer inducements for actual action on the part of the North Koreans. And that did not occur on our watch. So on the positive side, from an American perspective, there were no further nuclear tests. There were no ICBM tests. On the negative side, especially from a Japanese perspective in particular, the North Koreans honed their intermediate and short-range missiles and increased capabilities there as well. The last military parade last year, again, it appeared as if a new missile was unveiled there.
Big one.
Yeah, a big one. So, I think there's a mixed bag. But this was also, frankly, because our approach was so different than the Moon administration's approach. That was another cause for tension in the relationship. And that's why I would say, again, SMA in particular caught everybody's attention. And, we could have done a better job of managing that issue, in my opinion, hindsight being 2020. But there are other more fundamental issues and more foundational to the alliance where we and the Moon administration were just not aligned. And I would argue the Biden administration is not going to be any more aligned than we were with the Moon administration. So approach the DPRK being one. And again, fundamentally, we were just not willing to repeat the mistakes of the past in dealing with the regime in Pyongyang.
Right. Well, we're a couple days. I think we could be as soon as a week away from the completion of the review, which is now taking place in the Biden administration. So we'll know a lot more about that, and we can revisit it. I want to call on Sam Bowe. Sam, you had a question following this line of thinking, then I'll take a few more from the queue. Sam Bowe is from GPS. I know.
Okay.
Hi, sir. Thank you for being here today. Kind of in line with actually what we were just talking about, my question for you is, so the Biden administration is nearing the end of its review of the U.S. policy on North Korea. In official statements from both SecDef Austin and SecState Blinken, they've mentioned the official position of the U.S. is now denuclearization of North Korea rather than denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula as it has been in the past. So do you think there's intent in this specific language change, and what might that be?
Sure. Well, I think, first of all, great question. I think that unfortunately, the United States, we have not been particularly disciplined in how we articulate what our objective is. And our objective has and should be the denuclearization of North Korea, as opposed to the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. So those of you that are Korea watchers and Korea hands probably understand the difference. Those of us who are not necessarily Korea experts may not have understood the nuance. And that's where the problem is, because the North Koreans talk about denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. And although the United States withdrew nuclear weapons from South Korea a while ago,
1991.
The North Koreans use this term because they are implying as well that this refers to the nuclear umbrella under which South Korea, as our treaty ally, finds itself. So for the North Koreans, it means something completely different. And I'm very heartened to see that the Biden administration is again utilizing, because again, this is not new, but they're now again re-emphasizing its denuclearization of the DPRK. And I hope that there's strict discipline across the interagency in ensuring we use that vernacular when we talk about what is our actual objective, because the Korean objective, the North Korean objective, is quite different.
Yeah. Yeah, boy, that's a long conversation in itself. What do we mean by denuclearization and the complications of some of that language being in the Singapore Declaration?
Yes.
I want to go to Jade Reedy has a really good, interesting, somewhat complicated question. I'm going to kind of take it apart in pieces and reformulate a little bit. But Jade's asking, you know, how much of a problem do you think there is at this point in the divergence in perceptions of threat in Seoul and Washington? I mean, if you look at the 2+2 meetings, for example, you see, you know, much more forward statement in Japan and in Tokyo than you saw in Seoul.
Yeah.
You've got the, Jade pointed out that you've got these disagreements over things like Huawei, how forward to be on China.
Yeah.
What do you think, Heino? I mean, should we be worried about so-called alliance drift, or is this problem exaggerated?
Well, I will tell you, my opinion is that this is what gave me the most concern as DASD for East Asia. I saw the alliance again growing apart in terms of how the Moon administration and the U.S. government viewed the China challenge. And I believe that fundamentally is the biggest issue and challenge we have in the bilateral relationship. Like you said, the 2+2 statements, I mean, night and day between Tokyo and Seoul. You know, unfortunately, I lost a lot of hair negotiating joint statements with the Koreans, to the point where I will tell you, you know, I mean, what's in it and what's not in it. Anybody who's worked these issues knows, you know, how to read in between the lines. And the fact that the Korean joint statement, you know, the 2+2, didn't mention China at all. It also did not mention denuclearization of the DPRK at all.
Or denuclearization. It didn't even mention.
Right, that's right, absolutely. You know, I can guarantee you that whatever draft the U.S. government worked on had those things in there, and the Koreans refused. And I would tell you, at my level, again, to be perfectly candid, some of my worst nights were spent working on stuff like this with my Korean friends, to the point where I would say, you know what, you know, this is the final version. And when I say final, I mean final. No kidding this time. And if you don't agree, I respect that. And we just won't do a joint statement. Because frankly, it ain't that important to us. It's much more important to you. And you know, on China, the view of the Moon administration, I think, is just fundamentally different than certainly during the Trump administration, and I think it will continue in the Biden years as well. And it is, I believe, that the Moon administration has decided, for a variety of reasons, that South Korea's economic growth and progress is dependent on China, and that in the security and the defense arena, the Moon administration is willing to, in essence, put that as a lower priority than its economic relationship. So, very specifically, in 2017, I think it was, when the U.S. deployed a THAAD battery to South Korea, that cost the South Koreans, because of Chinese economic coercion, cost, I think, the South Koreans, 1% of GDP. It frankly scared the Moon administration. And they don't want to, if I may be very frank, they don't want to piss off the Chinese again. So the problem here is, you have a relatively, short to medium term issue that is going to impact the long-term viability of South Korea to be able to be the vibrant democracy that it has grown into over generations, having to live in the orbit of a very authoritarian state that is going to use all elements of national power in order to achieve its end states. And they've demonstrated that time and time again. Within the context of Seoul's relationship with Washington, D.C., again, we have a mutual defense treaty that is focused, obviously, on the DPRK threat. I believe that in the long run, and I'll leave it to you to determine what the timeline is, but in the long run, the United States is not going to be able to keep 28,500 troops in South Korea for one and only one mission, which is a contingency with the DPRK. Given the threat that the Chinese military poses to our interests in the region, to our allies and partners in the region, I can't envision us keeping that many forces in the long run in South Korea to only contend with North Korea.
And I just can't help jumping on this, Heino. So would your solution to this be to try to negotiate a circumstance under which those forces could be used for a wider array of purposes in the region? Or do you think that we can deter at a distance with a more minimal footprint on the Korean Peninsula altogether? I mean, could we draw down to 10,000? Could we draw down to 5,000?
So, I think fundamentally what is required is at the highest levels of government for us to have a conversation with President Moon now, or perhaps I actually think it might even be worth just waiting until the results of the next presidential election next year and having President Biden talk to his counterpart about the strategic outlook in the Indo-Pacific. And, having a frank and honest conversation, because a U.S. military that is going to get smaller undoubtedly on President Biden's watch, and a defense budget that will undoubtedly get smaller during this administration. Keeping 28,500 troops for only one mission in a country where, at least currently, the government has fundamentally, I think, a different view of the challenges that China poses. There's a disconnect there, frankly.
Yeah. Heino, listen, this has been just, very, very interesting conversation for all of us on the call. There's just no substitute for talking with someone who's been in the thick of this and had to struggle with a president who sometimes went in a somewhat different direction, as one of our
How about President Moon, right?
Right. Oh, that's exactly what I was talking about. But I really hope we can do this again and maybe put you in touch with some of our FAOs and other people interested in security. But again, let's all give a big round of applause, virtual in this case, to Heino, and hope we can get you back either virtually or in San Diego at some point in the future. Thanks very much, Heino.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Yeah. Good night. Thank you.
That's really terrific.